Hello, this is part 2 of Justice and Society's second extra lecture about two views on contract theory. The second part, we're going to deal with the second and third sections in the selection from Thomas Hobbes. The second section is on page 673, and the third section is on page 674. On page 673, Hobbes defines what a right of nature is, what liberty is as he's using it, and what a law of nature is. He says a right of nature is what every single person is naturally entitled to just by being a person. So we're talking about social contract theory, and we're talking about an early formulation of what we think in contemporary society is of human rights. There was other human right and natural law theory in the Middle Ages. It was quite extensive. But again, this is one of the first that's totally divorced from religious scholarship. He also then goes on to give an example of what a right of nature is. On page 673, he says every person is entitled to use all the skills, abilities, and powers that they have to stay alive and prosper. So in addition to having a right to your own body and mind, and you are also endowed with this right naturally just by being a person to use your physical abilities, like to labor, and you also naturally have the ability to think. Now, every single person has this right. So far, we have nothing to say about what happens when two people's rights and powers clash or interact. There are no rules. Everybody can take whatever they want. Total absolute freedom. Because you have the right, given the kind of creature that you are as a human person, to use your skills to stay alive. The second thing he defines is liberty. And again, we're just talking about external freedom, not being restrained. We need the right of nature definition and the liberty definition to reason out to the laws of nature. So the law of nature isn't something that you're endowed with necessarily that is obvious, like a right to your own body. A law of nature is whatever can be reasoned out as to what is necessary to live and to prosper. So when we think about the state of nature and we realize that we have to give up some of our rights in order to secure a peaceful environment, we're coming to a law of nature, a general rule as to how life is or should be. So this war of all against all is the state that we're in, and we need to follow reason to figure out what that means for us. How do we proceed if we're in this state to make the world a better place, a safer place? The laws that he mentions in this selection, at least, he has a lot more in the original text on page 674. He says the first law that we reason to if we're in a state of war is that it's better to be in a state of peace, and that every reasonable and self-interested individual will see this as clear and just a fact. A state of peace is something that everyone should want. So they can also see, though, that they have to give up some of their freedom, some of their individual liberties to do whatever they want, whenever they want, in order to secure that peace. Because if your individual liberties aren't curbed a little, then any of those other thousands or millions or whatever people can also use their powers to take what they want from you. It'll always collapse down into the state of war of all against all. But then the question becomes, what freedom should we give up? What is it legitimate for a governmental power to take away from us, and why. He's still an advocate for individual personal liberty, but thinks it's obvious that we should automatically, so he thinks it's a natural law, should automatically give up the freedoms to do things. Don't do anything to others that you wouldn't want done to you. So if you wouldn't want someone to attack you violently, you cannot attack them violently. If you don't want someone scheming to take away all your wealth illegitimately, you can't have the freedom to do that either. The third law that Hobbes thinks necessarily follows is that justice is just simply people adhering to or obeying this covenant. So there's no abstract, universal code of justice just out there in any state of human living. Justice comes into play when we make this contract with one another. So covenant is just another word for contract. So if you just falsely pretended that you were going to follow a contract and then you didn't, we'd revert very quickly back to the state of no trust, back to the war of all against all. So rational individuals will understand that they can't just make a promise and break it. Everybody has to adhere to the covenant or contract. It's rationally necessary if you want to have a good life where you flourish. The social contract isn't really something you can opt out of if you are a rational, self-interested individual. To this end, though, he does take one sort of anticipated counter-argument, wherein he thinks, well, wouldn't it be better if most people didn't defect on the contract, so it held for all of society, but then there were a few defectors who made contracts and followed through with them when it suited their benefit or their need, and broke it whenever that suited their benefit or need. Hobbes thinks that collapses to an absurdity, because if you look one step further, the defectors will win eventually, and covenants or contracts will no longer matter. They'll never be honored. You couldn't trust anybody anymore. And then we're right back where we started, in the state of nature. Next, we're going to take a look at John Locke. We looked at some of his empiricist views when we looked at primary and secondary qualities, but he was also a foundational political theorist as well. He was working after Hobbes, of course, well into the scientific revolution. And the second treatise of government is massively influential still today. This is, again, only a little selection, but the full second treatise of government is, I guess, normally considered something like a pamphlet. It's not very, very long, maybe 100 pages. The selection we're going to read right now is a defense of private property. And this, unlike Hobbes's conclusions, still has some influence today. Of course, updated with contemporary concerns and language, but some of the underlying theory is still very influential. Locke actually comes to some opposite conclusions from Hobbes, where he is an impassioned defender of freedom and would not likely ever defend a monarchy. But what Locke does agree with Hobbes is that every person has a right to their own body and the powers that they have to keep themselves alive. And he defends this with reason. He thinks it's rationally self-evident. And he also defends it with biblical passages. So we have a different kind of state of nature in Locke's estimation, wherein we're still individuals. If we think about it pre-contract or just in addition. So if you are living in a world where all you have is your own labor, whether it's physical or mental, to meet your own bodily needs, You have the right to use your physical and mental capabilities to meet those needs, to keep yourself alive. The world's a common space. That's another thing that he agrees with, that you can look around and understand if you're a rationally self-interested person. And there are things that human beings need to survive. Everybody you know needs food, needs water, needs shelter, needs air. So the question becomes now, how do you allocate those resources if every single person has an equal right to it? Locke thinks you automatically own your own body and your own powers. So he cordoned this off into sections, and that's what it's going to be at the top of my titles. So this slide deals with paragraphs or sections 25 through 27. That's on page 676 and 677. So if you automatically own your own body and your own powers, you can use those things to gather basic goods, food and water and shelter. And Locke argues that when you do this, those things become yours, your private property, automatically, naturally. And this is even apart from a social contract and a government. You had labor, you mixed it in with the goods themselves and improved them. So no one can eat fruit if it's still on the tree. So when you pick the fruit, it becomes yours, your personal private property. Now these are going to be paragraphs 28 and 31 through 33. We're still on page 677. He says it's not theft to take from all the other people what you need. And I should have clarified in here, he means from the common area. You're not taking it from other people. We're still thinking about a field, a grove of trees, wild animals. For you to go out and hunt an animal or to take fruit from a tree, that's not theft when you take from the commons, because if you didn't, you'd die. So you don't need consent from anybody when you labor to meet just your own needs. So here he considers an objection. Somebody might interject and say, so anybody can take whatever they want or what they have the ability to. So that automatically might lead to somebody hoarding resources or being a lot more industrious than the average, working all the time to amass a collection of goods. And Locke says, no, that's not rational and it's not justified in the Bible. You're committing an offense if you take more than you need and the rest of it rots. There's enough for everyone in the state of nature, and all individuals are working to survive. He knows, however, that our society is more complex. The next step would be farming, and to farm you have to cordon off land. So that becomes your private property. But is that justified? It was okay to take just as much as you needed to survive, but is it okay to actually cordon off land and not allow others to use their labor on it? Locke thinks that the same justifications apply to the land as they did to the food and water. So it helps you take what you need. You're mixing your own labor with the common resources, and that adds value to it. Furthermore, he adds, regarding that last point, that human labor makes things vastly more valuable than the things in themselves. So when you just have an uncultivated field, it has some value. It might have something edible in it or some materials to build a shelter. But when you actually put your labor in cultivation of crops, it produces much, much more than it would in a natural state. And that's true of things like clothes, that's true of shelters, or whatever it is that human beings produce with their labor. I think he says something like 99% of the value is the human labor. Paragraphs 46 to 48. So we've gone now to the bottom of page 678. If we're in an agrarian society, which is just a society that's mostly farming, the next step in our history was to move away from that. We had cities, we had industry, and we had abstract wealth. We moved from goods that directly meet our basic needs to goods that have an intermediate step before it can meet any of our biological needs. So money, jewels, or any other goods really that are not directly related to survival. For Locke, this is a natural extension of property. There's still a common, and labor is still mixed with raw goods, and it can still be shared. Non-perishable property, however, provides an outlet for those who want to work harder to gather status and wealth, because perishable goods can be traded for it. So it's still a crime against reason and the tenets of the Christian faith to hoard so much that the goods perish. So you get so much food that it rots. Or you have so many animals that you can't take care of them because you're depriving other people of their rights to take care of themselves when you do stuff like that. But if you're moving to status and wealth based on an abstract, it no longer does that. So he thinks owning that abstract wealth is also justified. So it's a different take on contract theory, and it has a little bit more of a positive view about how we all interact with one another in the absence of a strong government to enforce peace. There are problems or issues with both Hobbes and Locke. What I would want you to think about is Hobbes's state of nature accurate? We all know that there is competition in the world, but we also know there's communication. We also know that if competition and adversity are natural, why wouldn't cooperation and peace be natural as well? Trust, people working together. He also thought the government had to have a lot of power to control the population. If it didn't, people would rebel, disobey these basic social covenants. They'd start taking whatever it is they wanted or what they thought they needed. So the question, not a lot of people agree that we need monarchy or some sort of totalitarian state. But you don't have to agree to see the point that we know government has to have some power. So how powerful is the right amount of power? You can agree that government might be what prevents social chaos. How strong does it have to be in order to do so? So you can come up with anything from sort of laissez-faire, libertarian kind of government. You can come out with a strong, centralized, sort of maybe socialist government, or a strong, centralized capitalist government. There are a lot of different options that give the government different rights and powers, which take away your rights and powers. Okay, so Locke, an issue with Locke is he says that laboring entities have an entitlement to the fruits of their labor. I want you to think about if that's always the case. So does your labor always belong to you? Are there any counterexamples that you can think about? Another one is just about the whole structure of labor itself. There's no reason that if it's guaranteed by reason and by religious convictions, that everybody should have enough to sustain themselves at least. The question is, why couldn't we labor communally? Why does it have to be individual property? And one of the most common issues with at least this section of Locke is the tragedy of the commons. So you may or may not have heard of this issue before, but the idea is that if there is an unregulated common, so you don't have a social contract, you don't have a body enforcing how much you're allowed to take or what you can do with the resources in common, it appears that people will just take more and more until the commons is depleted, and then there's none for anyone. That is the end of the second extra lecture for Justice and Society. We've talked about two views on the social contract. Please let me know if you have any questions, and have a good day.